Today's lesson is about hip opening. This seems to be a scourge for most of my men, at least the male athletes that I have come to the office. And in some cases, women don't like doing this. It's either you love hip opening or you hate it. But the bottom line is that when anybody has any problems with back dysfunction, pelvic dysfunction, iliotibial band syndrome, the hip always has to be worked on whether you like it or not. You can either work on it slowly but surely with on your own with poses, or you have a physical therapist crank on your hip. But bottom line is that of all the poses that we do in yoga, the ones I'm going to show you are my favorite. They usually are held for quite some time. You have to try to relax the trunk, the shoulders, use the body weight to open the hip, and there will be one point in time when you'll notice it just gives way, because the hip, if you look at the anatomy of the hip, it's a ball and socket joint, and the ball and socket is made for strength and stability. The ball and socket also has several ligaments that pass around it and almost wrap or circle around the joint, so it really limits the range. And when you don't do anything but straight on running and very little on the lateral movements, it makes all the muscles, not only the ligaments but all the muscles, very tight to lateral and only accessible to front and back movements. And most of you that just do that will know that your hamstrings are super tight. And as I always get with my patients when I suggest yoga for flexibility and hip opening, the usual reaction is, oh, I'm not that flexible, it's not that great of a sport for me, when in actuality that should be the way you practice the pre-warm-up. Anyway, we're going to try a couple things. First thing will be half pigeon, Ekapada Raja Kapotasana, and runners will do this easily on the ground, but I'm going to show you alternatives with a chair. This is a sliding stool, might be easier. Usually the leg is placed in front at a perpendicular level to the back leg. I like sliding stools because you can actually gain a little bit of stretch as you lean forward, and if you're not used to the strength of this, then you do it on a chair. But lean forward, you get a deeper stretch, trying to keep your back heel in the ground. I'm lifting mine up. I'm wearing boots today. But you'll feel a stretch in the hip, the IT band, and the glute. And you just hold it in this position, relaxed, until you feel that it starts to stretch a little more. Slow, deep breaths, and then return back. And always in yoga, you do opposite side. Pick your position, maintain stability, and then stretch. Once you get to the level that you can get to, where it's not painful but working the joint, then you hold and breathe. The alternative is to relax down and take the weight off, then just let the muscles start to loosen up. Whether you choose upright or down, it's up to you. An alternative to this is to use a table, placing the leg at the table, and just leaning into it until you feel some good stretch, or at least a point that you feel resistance in holding. And again, you do it to both sides. And I can do this with boots, so you should be able to easily get by, do this during a lunch break if you want. You'll feel a stretch in the IT band, a stretch in the glute and the piriformis, and it'll feel very tight to the hip. That's normal. But the more you practice and hold, the easier it gets and the more flexibility you gain. An option is something called a figure four. Figure four is kind of like an entry-level way to stretch out your hip. You just hold the legs as is, and you try to lean in and stretch out the hip this way with weight, body weight, resistance with leaning into it. You can even do it standing. figure four standing. There's a flying figure four where you place both hands on the ground and you lift up, but that takes away from the stretch that we're trying to get in the hip. You'll really feel it to the IT band and the piriformis. There's also an option for supine figure four. If it's too much, you just fold over figure four and bring the leg up. And there's also threading the needle where you apply more resistance. Let the head sit back and you just hold while you breathe. On the mat, pigeon can be started in from any position, but sometimes going from fire log, where both legs are placed in front. I'm assuming it's like a bunch of fire logs, but both legs are placed in front. It's like doing a half pigeon on both sides. Technically it's not called full pigeon. There's another form of full pigeon that's more advanced. You can actually take fire log from this position, where you again get stretching to both sides, and you take the top leg, bring it around to the back, keeping the front leg parallel to the front of the mat, the back leg now perpendicular to the front. You can stretch out into a pigeon this way. The objective of any hip opener is to get to the point of resistance that you can tolerate and it's not painful, and you just hold the position for deep breathing. The deep breathing, I'll put a link to my breath exercises, especially Andy Weil's 478, which is great for beginners. And you just hold and breathe. Once you learn to relax the hip muscles, usually you'll be able to feel a little bit of a give and or more flexibility. It takes a while. This is more of the pose that you hold. There's an easier way to do this with a bolster in the front, where you put your pigeon to sleep, leaning forward, you rest on the elbows, and if you can make it to the ground, you rest to the ground, head to the ground. When you're down, technically your third eye is touching the ground, front of your mat, but you can also audibly hear the ujjayi breathing, and it'll get you more focused on your breath versus the tight hip that you're trying to stretch out. And again, you always do both sides to be symmetric. There is something called Happy Baby, also done on the mat. Very easy beginner or entry-level pose, lying on the back. You grab the outside legs or feet, both sides, and you slowly bring the knees down to the armpits, stretching out the hamstrings and holding for breath again. Sometimes if you rock back and forth, it also massages the low back. Malasana is a nice, also an entry-level hip opener. It's done with the feet. Usually it's from standing, but you can enter this into any pose or from any pose. Feet at the edges of your mat, 45 degrees out. Hips as far as down as you can get them. Then you put your hands in prayer and you slowly push each knee out with the elbows, keeping your back straight. This is technically called garland pose. In garland pose, you actually wrap your arms around the back, join them in the back. You don't have, that's more advanced. This is just a comfortable way to hold the pose for a while you work on your breath exercises. So that's second to last. This is my last one. One of the toughest, and I don't like it, but it's a rock climber's favorite. The rock climbers like to hug the wall in almost like a squatting position. And the better the flexibility to the front of the thighs and the hips, the closer they have to stay to the wall with the less need for holding on. This is frog pose. This is why I have the sliders here. My hips are not too bad, but you usually take a tabletop pose. If you get your knees on sliders, it makes it a little bit easier so you don't have to feel the friction from the floor or the wood. And the feet you try to keep perpendicular or parallel to the edge of the mat. You slowly just lower the hips. The feet can stay in like a child's pose,
or they can stay parallel to the mat. Once you get to the point of resistance to both hips, then you, just like in pigeon pose, get on the elbows. If you have a bolster, great. Then you just maintain the position while working on breath. Sometimes to put extra stress on the hip, you can actually push back a little bit. But again, that's more advanced, and you have to know your limitations. There are some martial artists who can get into a full wide-legged stance. But again, that's more advanced. And the sliders, you can use blocks, you can use the edge of one of the yoga straps, or face towels. So just, you have to be careful with, if it's your first time, the pressure points to the knees are very sensitive for some people, so cushioning helps. So that's my usual go-tos when it comes to hips. You have to be very patient with this. Again, hip poses are usually meant to be done both sides and held for quite some time. They're usually done at the end. There's a lot of emotion that gets released in yoga class when you can hold a pose, work on breath, and then actually after you, if it's done properly and if you're guided by the teacher properly, you'll actually kind of click back into your awareness of the class, and in 3 to 5 minutes would have passed and you're actually touching the ground, or you're in your maximum range of motion for your hip. It's said that in many classes people tend to get very emotional when they get to the point of the hip flexibility, especially pigeon pose.